Chapter 24 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 24. On the following day, the Marquis de Bienville found the execution of any intentions he might have had towards Derek Pruyn postponed by the circumstance that Miss Regina Van Tromp was dead. The helpless, inarticulate life, which for 3 years had served as a bond to hold more active existences together, had failed suddenly, leaving in the little group a curious impression of collapse. It became perceptible that the hushed sick-room, where Miss Lucilla and Mrs. Eveleth were the only ministrants, had in reality been a centre for those who had never entered it. Now that the living presence was withdrawn, there came the consciousness of dispersing interests, inseparable from the passing away of the long-established, which gives the spirit pause. The days before the funeral became a period of suspended action, in which life refrained from too marked a manifestation of its energies, out of reverence for death. Even when the grave was filled in, and the will read, and the family face to face with its new conditions, there was a respectful absence of hurry in beginning the work of reconstruction. The lull lasted, in fact, till James Van Tromp arrived from Paris, and was broken only then by the banker's desire to get things settled with all possible speed, so that he might return to the Rue Auber. The first sign of real disintegration came from Mrs. Eveleth. She waited for the arrival of the man whom she looked upon now as her confidential adviser, to make the announcement that, since Miss Lucilla would no longer need her, she meant to have a home of her own. The economies she had been able to practice during the last 2 years, together with a legacy from Miss Van Tromp, would, when added to her own income, provide her with modest comfort for the rest of her days. There was something triumphant in the way in which she proclaimed her independence of the daughter-in-law who had been the author of so many of her woes. It was the old banker himself who brought this intelligence to Diane. During the fortnight he had been in New York, he had formed an almost daily habit of dropping in on her. He was the more surprised at his doing so from the fact that her detachment from the rest of the circle of which she had formed a part was now complete. She had gone to see Miss Lucilla with words of sympathy, but her reception was such that she came away with cheeks flaming. Miss Lucilla had said nothing. She had only wept. But she wept in a way to show that Diane herself, more than the departed Miss Regina, was the motive of her grief. After that, Diane had remained shut up in her linen room, finding in its occupied seclusion something of the peace which the nun seeks in the cloister. There was no one but the old man to push his way into her sanctuary, and for his visit she was grateful. They not only relieved the tedium of her days, but they brought her news from that small world into which her most vital interests had become absorbed. "So the old lady is set up for life on your money," he observed, as he watched Diane hold a white tablecloth up to the light and search it for imperfections. "It isn't my money now, and even if it were, I'd rather she had the use of it. She would have had much more than that if it hadn't been for me." "She might, and then again she mightn't. Who'll tell you what would have happened if everything had been different from what it is? There are people who think they would have had plenty of money if it hadn't been for me, but that doesn't prove they're right." "In any case, I'm glad she has it." "That's because you're a very foolish little woman, as I told you when you came to me 3 years ago. I said then that you'd be sorry for it some day." "But I'm not." Don't tell me. Can't I see with my own eyes? No woman could lose her good looks as you've done and not know she'd made a mistake. How old are you now?" "I'm 27.
Oh, dear me, you look 40.
I feel 80.
Yes, I dare say you do. Anyone who's got into so many scrapes as you have must feel the burden of time. I don't think I've ever saw a young woman make such poor use of her opportunities. Why didn't you marry Derek Pruyn?"
Diane kept herself quite still, her needle arrested halfway through its stitch. She took time to reflect that it was useless to feel annoyed at anything he might say, and when she formed her answer, it was in the spirit of meeting him in his own vein. "What makes you think I ever had the chance?"
"Because I gave it to you myself." You, Mr. Van Tromp? Yes, me. I did all that wire pulling when he first came to New York. I did it just so that you might catch him. Oh? I did, he declared proudly. If you'd been the woman I took you for, you could have had him. But suppose I didn't want him? Oh, don't tell me that, he said pityingly. Why shouldn't you want him? Just as much as he'd want you. Well, I'll put it that way if you like. Suppose he didn't want me. And the more fool he. I picked you out for him on purpose. May I ask why? Certainly. I saw he was getting on in life, and as he'd been a good many years a widower, I imagined he'd had some difficulty in getting anyone to have him. If he's good-looking, he's not what you'd call very bright. He's got a temper like, well, I won't say what. I pity the woman who got him, that's all, and so you thought you'd pity me? I did pity you as it was. It seemed to me you couldn't be worse off, not even if you married Derek Pruyn. It was certainly good of you to give me the opportunity, and if I had only known, you would have let it slip through your fingers just the same. You're one of the young women who will always stand in their own light. I dare say now that if I told you I was willing to marry you myself, you wouldn't profit by the occasion. I should never want to profit by your loss, Mr. Van Tromp. But suppose I could afford to lose. Unable to answer him there, she held her peace. It was a relief that before he had time to speak again, a page boy knocked at the door and entered with a card. Diane took it hastily and read the name. "Tell the gentleman I can't see him," she said, with a visible effort to speak steadily. "Wait," the banker ordered, as the boy was about to turn. "Who is it?" Without ceremony, he drew the card from Diane's hand and looked at it. "Ha!" he cried. "It's Bienville, is it? Of course you'll see him. Of course you will, of course. Here, boy, I'll go with you." Returning to Gramercy Park after this interview, the banker pottered about his apartment until, on hearing the doorbell ring, he looked out of the window and recognized Derek Pruyn as his chauffeur. On the stairs as he went down, he heard Miss Lucilla's voice in the hall. "Oh, come in, Derek. Marian isn't here yet, but she won't be long. I asked you to come punctually because I gather from her note that she wanted to see you very particularly, without Mrs. Bayford's knowledge. She's evidently something on her mind that she wants to tell you." "Hello, dears," the old man interrupted suddenly, as, leaning heavily on the banister, he descended the stairs. "I've got good news for you." "Good news, Uncle James?" Miss Lucilla said reproachfully. With her long grave face and in her heavy crape, she looked as though she found good news decidedly out of place. "The very best," the banker declared, reaching the hall and taking his nephew and niece each by an arm. "Come into the library and I'll tell you. There," he went on, pushing Miss Lucilla into an armchair. "Sit down, Derek, and make yourself comfortable. Now listen, both of you. Perhaps you're going to have a new aunt." "Oh, Uncle James!" Miss Lucilla cried in the voice of a person about to faint. "You're going to be married!" Derek roared with the fury of a father addressing a wayward son. "The young woman," the banker went on to explain, "is of French extraction, but Irish on the mother's side." Derek grasped the arms of his chair and half rose, making an inarticulate sound. "Shush, shush," the old man went on, lifting a warning hand. "She's had reverses of fortune, but that wasn't the reason why she came to me. Though her husband had just died, leaving nothing, she had her own dough, on the income on which she had lived. That didn't suit her. Her husband had left a mother who had neither dough nor anything else in the world. At the age of 60, the old woman was a pauper. My little lady came to see me in order to transfer all her own money secretly to her mother-in-law, and face the world herself with empty hands." "My God!" Mary breathed just audibly. Miss Lucilla sat upright and tense, hot tears starting to her eyes. "Lucky, wasn't it?" the uncle went on complacently. "I didn't approve of it at first, but I let her do it in the end, knowing that some good fellow would make it up to her." "Don't joke, uncle," Derek cried nervously. "It's too serious for that." "I'm not joking. It's what I think. And if the world wasn't full of idiots who couldn't tell diamonds from glass, a little woman like that would have been snapped up long ago." Derek sprang up and strode across the room. "You mean to tell me," he demanded, turning abruptly. "That she made over all her money to Mrs. Eveleth, a woman who had deserted her like the rest of us?" "That's what she did. But there's this to be said for the old lady, that she doesn't know it. She thinks it's the wreck of her own fortune, and Diane wouldn't let me tell her the truth. Since you seem to be interested in the little story," he added with sarcasm, "you may hear all about it." With tolerable accuracy he gave the details of his first interview with Diane, 3 years previous. Long before he finished, Lucilla was weeping silently, while Derek stood like a man turned to stone. Even the banker's own face took on an expression of whimsical gravity as he said in conclusion, "So I've decided to give her a home. That is," he added significantly, "if no one else will." "Do you mean that from me?" Derek asked, in a tone too low for Lucilla to hear it. "Oh no, not particularly. I mean it from anyone." "Clarence," Derek went on, "as for me, I'm not worthy to have her under my roof." The banker made no comment, sitting in a hunched attitude and humming to himself in a cracked voice, while Derek stared down at him. They were still in this position when Marian Grimston was shown in. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 25. Greetings having been exchanged, it was Miss Lucilla's policy to draw her uncle away to some other room, leaving Marian free to have her conference with Pruyn. But the old man settled himself in his chair again with no intention of quitting the field. Derek, too, entered on the task of dislodging him, but without success. Nursing his knee and peering at Marian with bulgy, short-sighted eyes, the banker kept her answering questions as to Mrs. Bayford's health, blind to her obvious nervousness and distress. The cousins exchanged baffled, impatient glances, while Lucilla managed to say in an undertone, "Take Marian to the drawing-room. We'll never get him to go." Derek was about to comply with this suggestion when the footman threw open the library door again. For a moment no one appeared, though a sound of smothered voices from the hall caused the four within the room to sit in strangely aroused expectancy. "No, no, I can't go in," came a woman's whispered protest. "You can do it without me." "You must," was the man's response, and a second later Bienville was on the threshold, standing aside as Diane Eveleth entered. Derek sprang to his feet, but, as if petrified by a sense of his own impotence, stood still. Miss Lucilla, with the instinct of the hostess awake, even in these strange conditions, went forward with her hand half outstretched, and the words "Monsieur de Bienville" on her lips. The old banker rose, and, taking Diane's hand, drew it within his arm in a protecting way, for which she was grateful, while she suffered him to lead her some steps apart. Marian Grimston alone, seated in a distant corner, did not move. With her arm resting on a small table, she watched the rapidly enacted scene with the detachment of a spectator looking at a play. She had thrown back her black veil over her hat, and, against the dark background, her face had the grave marble whiteness of classic features in stone. During the minute of interrogatory silence that ensued, Bienville, with quick reversion to the habits of the drawing-room, was able to re-establish his self-control. With his hat, his gloves, and his stick, he had that air of the casual visitor which helped to give him back the sensation of having his feet on accustomed ground. "I must beg your pardon, Miss Van Tromp, for disturbing you," he said, addressing himself to Miss Lucilla, who stood in the foreground. "I shouldn't have come so if I hadn't something of great importance to say." His voice was so calm that Miss Lucilla could not do otherwise than reply in the same vein of commonplace formality. "Very glad to see you, Monsieur de Bienville. Won't you sit down? I was just going to ring for tea." "Thank you," he said, with a wave of the hand that declined without words the proffered entertainment. "Perhaps I had better say what I have to say and go." "Oh, do you think so?" Having fulfilled her necessary duties as mistress of the house, she felt at liberty to fall back, leaving Bienville isolated in the doorway. "Mr. Pruyn," he said, after further brief hesitation, I come to make a confession which can scarcely be a confession to anyone in this room but you." Derek grew white to the lips, but remained motionless, while Bienville went on. "On the way up from South America last spring, I said certain things about a certain lady which were not true. I said them first out of thoughtless folly, but I maintained them afterward with deliberate intent. When I pretended to take them back, I did so in a way which, as I knew, must convince you further." "It did." As he brought out the two words, Derek tried to look at Diane, but she was clinging to the arm of old James Van Tromp, while her frightened eyes were riveted on Bienville. "I'm telling you the truth today," Bienville continued, "partly because circumstances have forced my hand, partly because someone whom I greatly respect desires it, and partly because something within myself, I might almost call it the manhood I've been fighting against, has made it imperative. I've come to the point where my punishment is greater than I can bear. I'm not so lost to honour as not to know that life is no longer worth the living when honour is lost to me." He spoke without a tremor, leaning easily on the cane he held against his hip. "I must do myself the justice to say that the wrong of which I was guilty had its origin, at the first, in a sort of inadvertence. I had no intention of doing anyone irreparable harm. I was taking part in a game, but I meant to play it fairly. The lady of whom I speak would bear me out when I say that the people among whom she and I were born, in France, in Paris, engage in this game as a sort of sport, and we call it love. It isn't love in any of the senses in which you understand it here. We give it a meaning of our own. It's a game that requires the combination of many kinds of skill, and if it doesn't call for a conspicuous display of virtues, it lays all the greater emphasis on its own few stringent rules. Like all other sports, it demands a certain kind of integrity, in which the moralist could easily pick holes, but which nevertheless constitutes its saving grace. Well, in this game of love I beat it. I said one day that I had won when I hadn't won. I said it to people who welcomed my victory, not through friendship for me, but from envy of her." The perspiration began to stand in beads upon Bienville's forehead, but he held himself erect and went on with the same outward tranquillity. His eyes were fixed on Prun's, on his, in a gaze from which even the nearest objects were excluded. "In the little group in which we lived, her position was peculiar. She was both within our gates and without them. While she was one of us by birth, she was a stranger by education and by marriage. She was admitted with a welcome, and at the same time with a question. She was a mark for enmity from the very first. There was something about her that challenged our institutions. And among our worn-out passions and moribund ideals, she brought a freshness we resented. She made our prejudices seem absurd from contrast with her own sanity, and showed our moral standards to be rotten by the light of the something clear and virginal in her character. I can't tell you how this effect was brought about, but there were a few of us who weren't aware of it, as there were a few of us who didn't hate it. There was but one impulse among us, to catch her in a fault and make her no better than ourselves. The daring of her innocence afforded us many opportunities, and we made use of them. One man after another confessed himself defeated. Then came my turn. I wasn't merely defeated, I was put to utter rout, with ridicule and scorn. That was too much for me. I couldn't stand it, and I lied. "Bienville, that will do," cried out in a pleading wail. "Don't say any more." "I'm not sure that there's any more I need to say. The rest can be easily understood. Everyone knows how a man who lies once is obliged to lie again, and again, and yet again, unless he frees himself, as I do. When I began, I thought I had it in me to go on heroically, but I hadn't. I can't keep it up. I'm not one of the master villains who command respect from force of prowess.
I'm a weakling in evil, as in good, fit neither for God nor for the devil. But that's my affair. I needn't trouble anyone here with what only concerns myself. It's too late for me to make everything right now, but I'll do what I can before, he stammered on. I'll write to the people. There were only a few of them, to whom I actually used the words I did. I'll ask them to correct the impression I have given. I know they'll do it when they know. He stopped helplessly. The lustre died out of his eyes, and his pallor became sallowness. But I've said enough, he began again, making a tremendous effort to regain his self-mastery. You can have no doubt as to my meaning, and you will be able to fill in anything I may have left unspoken. But now, he added, sweeping the room with a look, now I'd better go. Oh, by God, you infernal scoundrel, shouted Derek Pruyn. You shall not go. All the suffering of months shot out in the red gleam of his eyes, while the muscular tension of his neck was like that of an infuriated mastiff. In 3 strides he was across the room, with clenched fist uplifted. Bienville had barely time to fold his arms and stand with feet together and head erect, awaiting the blow. Go on, he said, as Derek stood with hand poised above him. Go on. There was a second of breathless stillness. Then slowly the clenched fingers began to relax, and the open hand descended softly, gently, on Bienville's shoulder. Between the two men there passed a look of things unspeakable, till, with bent head and drooping figure, Derek wheeled away. I'll say good-bye, now. Bienville's voice was husky, but he bowed with dignity to each member of the company in turn, until Marian grimaced at last. Basil! The name arrested him as he was about to go. He looked at her inquiringly. Basil, she said again, without rising from her place, I promised that if you ever did what you've done today, I would be your wife. You did, he answered, but I've already given you to understand that I'd claim no such reward. It isn't you who would be claiming the reward, it's I. I've suffered much. I've earned it. The very fact that you've suffered much would be my motive in not allowing you to suffer more. Raoul, no man knows the sources of a woman's joy and pain. How can you tell from what is to save me? There's one thing from which I must save you. From uniting your destiny with that of a man who has no future. From pouring the riches of your heart into a bottomless pit where they could do no one any good. Thank you, mademoiselle, with all my soul. I've asked you many times for your love. Of the hard things I've had to do today, the hardest is to give it back to you. Now, when at last you offer it. Don't add to my bitterness by urging it on me. Raoul, she cried, raising herself up, you don't understand. We regard these things differently here from the way in which you do in France. It may be true, as you say, that in losing your honour you've lost all, in French eyes. But we don't feel like that. We never look on anyone as beyond redemption. You should consider that a man who has been brave enough to do what you've done today has gone far to establish his moral regeneration. You can honour him in certain ways, Raoul, almost more than if he had never done wrong at all. None of us would condemn him or cast a stone at him. Should we, Lucilla? Should we, Mr. Pruyn? No, no, Miss Lucilla sobbed. We pity him, we take him to our hearts. She's right, Bienville, Derek muttered, nodding towards Marian. Better do just as she says. I'm a Frenchman. I'm a Bienville. I can't accept mercy. But you can bestow it, the girl cried passionately. Anyone would tell you that, after all that has happened, after this, I should be happier in sharing your life than in being shut out of it. I appeal to you, Miss Lucilla. I appeal to you, Diane. Can any woman be proud to be the wife of Raoul de Bienville after what he's done this afternoon, no matter how the world turns against him? These ladies, in the goodness of their hearts, might say anything they chose, but nothing would alter their conviction that for you to be my wife would be only to add misery to mistake. That's so, the old banker corroborated, smacking his lips. But you wouldn't be much worse when you've done that than you are now. So why not just let her have her way? Bienville tried to speak again,
but his dry lips refused to frame the words. "No, but impossible. Drag you down," came incoherently from him, when by a quick backward movement he stepped over the threshold into the semi-obscurity of the hall. The act was so sudden that a second had already elapsed before Marian Grimson uttered the cry that rent her like the wail of some strong primordial creature without the power of tears. "I will come back." With rapid motion she glided across the room and was in the hall. "I will come back." She had descended the hall and had almost reached him as he opened the door to pass out. "I love you." The door closed as, falling against it, she sank to the floor. Before Miss Lucilla and James Van Tromp could reach her, she was already losing consciousness. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 26. "Oh, stay where you are. I'll go." Derek spoke with the terse command of subdued excitement, almost pushing Diane back, as she too attempted to go to Marian's assistance. She sank obediently into one of the great chairs, too dazed even for curiosity as to what was passing in the hall. Derek closed the door behind him, and though confused sounds of voices and shuffling feet reached her, she gave them but a dulled attention. It was not till he came back that her stunned intelligence revived sufficiently to enable her to think. He closed the door again, throwing himself wearily into another of the big leathern chairs. "They've taken her into Lucilla's room. She'll be all right now. It was better that it should end like that."
"I'm not so sure. I'm afraid for him."
"Oh, he'll survive it."
"You don't know our Frenchmen. They're not like you nor any of you men. With their sensitiveness to honour and their indifference to moral right, it's difficult for you to understand them. I shouldn't be surprised at anything he might do."
"I'll go and see him tomorrow and try to knock a little reason into him."
"If it isn't too late."
"Oh, I dare say it will be. Everything seems to be too late."
"It's better that something should come too late rather than not at all."
"What things do you mean?"
"I suppose I mean the same things as you do." He gave a long sigh. There was something of a groan slipping down in his chair into an attitude, not of informality, but of dejection. For the moment neither was equal to facing the great subject that must be met.
"I wonder what Bienville will do to himself," he asked suddenly, changing his position with nervous brusqueness, leaning forward now with his elbows on his knees.
"I wish you'd go and see him tonight."
"Well, perhaps I will. I have a good deal of fellow feeling with him. I can't help thinking that he and I are in much the same box, and that he has shown me the way out."
"Derek!"
She sprang up with a cry of alarm, standing with hands crossed on her breast in a sudden access of terror. "Oh, don't be afraid," he laughed, grimly staring up at her. "I'm not his sort. There are no heroics about me. Under my stamp don't make theatrical exits. We're too confoundedly sane. Whether we do well or whether we do ill, we plod along on our treadmill round from the house to the office, and from the office to the grave, as if we've never had anything on the conscience. But if I had the spirit of Bienville, do you know what I should do?"
"No, no, no," she burst out. "Don't say it. Don't say it."
"Then I won't. But if Bienville thought of it, why shouldn't I? What has he done that is worse than what I've done? What has he done that's as bad? For after all, you were little or nothing to him, when you were everything to me. I knew you as he didn't know you. I'd lived in one house with you, watched you, studied you, tried you, put you to tests that you never knew anything about, and had seen you come through them successfully. I'd seen how you bore misfortune. I'd seen how you carried yourself in difficult situations. I'd seen the skill with which you ruled my house, and the wisdom with which you were more than a mother to my child. I'd seen you combine with all that is most womanly the patience and fortitude of a man. And it wasn't enough for me. It wasn't enough for me." He threw himself back into his seat with a desperate flinging out of the hands, letting his arms drop heavily over the sides of his chair, and his fingers touched the floor. "My God! My God!" he
groaned ironically. "It wasn't enough for me. I doubted her. I doubted her on the first idle word that came my way. I did more than doubt her. I hated her into my court, and tried her, and condemned her, and, as nearly as might be, put her to death. I, with my 100,000 sins, all of them as black as Erebus, are not pure enough for me. It ought to make one die of laughter. Diane," he went on in another tone, a tone of ghastly jocularity, "didn't it amuse you, knowing yourself to be what you are, knowing what you had done for Mrs. Eveleth, knowing the thing Bienville had just said of you? Didn't it amuse you to see me sitting in judgment on you?" "It doesn't amuse me to see you sitting in judgment on yourself." "Doesn't it? I don't think it would. It seems to me that if I saw a man who had done me so much harm visited with such awful justice as I am getting now, it would make up to me for nearly everything I have had to suffer." "In my case, it only adds to it. I wish you wouldn't say these things. If you ever did me wrong, I always knew it was a mistake." "Oh, Lord! Oh, Lord!" He laughed outright, getting up from his chair and dragging himself heavily across the room, where, with his hands in his pockets and his back against the bookshelves, he stood facing her. "What do you think of Bienville's attitude towards Marian Grimston?" he asked, with an inflection which would have sounded casual if it had not been for all that lay behind. "I can understand it, but I think he was wrong." "You think he ought to allow her to marry him?" "Weighing one thing with another, yes." "Would you marry a man who had shown himself such a hound?" "It would depend." "On what?" "Oh, on a good many things."
"Such as?"
He hesitated a minute before deciding whether or not to walk into his trap. But as his eyes were on the ground, and she felt stronger than a minute or two ago, he decided to do it. "It would depend, for one thing, on whether or not I loved him."
"And if you did love him?"
Again she hesitated, before making up her mind to speak. "It would depend on whether or not he loved me." She had given him his chance. The word he had never uttered must now come now or never. For an instant he seemed about to seize his opportunity, but when he actually spoke it was only to say,
"Would you marry me?"
"No," she gave her answer firmly.
"No."
"No."
"Why?"
She shrugged her shoulders and threw out her hand, and said nothing in words.
"Is it because I haven't expressed regret for all the things I have to regret?"
She shook her head.
"Because if it is," he went on, "I haven't done it only for the reason that the utmost expression would be so inadequate as to become a mockery.
When a man has sinned against light, as I've done, no mere cries of contrition are going to win him pardon. That must come as a spontaneous act of grace, as it wells out of the heart of the Most High. Or it can't come at all." "That isn't the reason."
"Then there's another one."
"Yes, another one."
"One that's insurmountable?"
"Yes, as things are, it's insurmountable." A look of dumb, unresenting sadness. He turned away, and, leaning on the mantelpiece, stood with his back towards her and his face buried in his hands. A minute went by in silence. When he spoke, it was over his shoulder, as it were, parenthetically.
"Diane, I love you."
He stood as he was, listening, but as if without much expectation, for a response. When none came, and he turned round inquiringly, he beheld in her that radiant change which was visible to those who saw the martyred Stephen's face as he gazed straight into heaven. For a long minute he stood spellbound and amazed. "Was it that?" he asked in a whisper. She gave him no reply. "It was that," he declared in the tone of a man making a discovery. "It was that." "Why did you tell me so before?" he found strength to say.
"Tell you, Diane? What was the use of telling you when you knew? My life has been open for you to look into as you would."
Yes, but not to go into. There's only one key that unlocks the inner shrine of all. The word you've just spoken. A woman knows nothing till she hears it. He looked at her with the puzzled air of a man getting strange information. Well, he said after a long pause, you've heard it. So what? Now? Now, I'm going to say that I love you. Well, I know that already, he returned. A man doesn't need to be told what he can see. That isn't what I'm asking. What I want to learn is not what you feel, but what you'll do. She smiled faintly. I'm asking what you'll do, he repeated. If you insist on my telling you that, he said, glancing up at him shyly, I'll say that since the inner shrine is unlocked at last, I'll go in. Then come. Come. He stood with arms open, his tone of petition still blended with the suggestion of command, as she crossed the room toward him. End of chapter 26. End of The Inner Shrine by Basil King.